Hi everyone, I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 newsroom. The France 24 debate is back in the next hour. We'll be talking about Lebanon. Let's go straight to Beirut. Correspondent Leila Molana-Allen brings us a special edition. Leila Molana-Allen will be with us shortly. It's coming on a momentous day with the second time inside of a month that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is visiting. He's due to touch down this hour. Also, the naming of a new prime minister, Mustafa Adib, who was jeered at times when he visited the bombed-out neighborhood near the port where that warehouse blew up on August the 4th, containing chemicals. It has left 183 dead and thousands injured. Special edition from Beirut on the day of the naming of that prime minister. France 24 correspondent Leila Molana-Allen has more.
I'm Leila Molana-Allen and welcome to this special edition live from Beirut on the day when Mustafa Adib has been named the new Prime Minister of Lebanon. He was selected today after the parliamentary blocs, 3/4 of their votes, went to him, and President Michel Aoun then requested that he become the new Prime Minister, and he will now need to form a cabinet. Here's a little bit more about the man who is the new Prime Minister of Lebanon.
He was almost unknown to the Lebanese people, but has now been propelled into the public eye. A former lecturer with a PhD in law and political science, Mustafa Adib was appointed Chief of Staff in 2011 under Prime Minister and billionaire Najib Mikati. Since 2013, he'd been serving as Lebanon's ambassador to Germany. But while he's being backed by a majority of MPs, protesters had already warned that they would reject any government formed by Adib. The protest movement has engulfed Lebanon for almost a year, with demonstrators urging for a political overhaul after growing tired of the elite that has ruled Lebanon for the past decades. As a result, major challenges lie ahead as Adib takes on his first term as Prime Minister at 48 years old. His new government will be expected to lift Lebanon out of the deepening political and economic crisis, which has only worsened since an explosion at Beirut's port left 200 people dead and destroyed part of the capital.
لا وقت للكلام والوعود والتمنيات. الوقت للعمل بكل قوة بتعاون الجميع من أجل تعافي وطننا واستعادة شعبنا الأمل بغد أفضل. لأن القلق كبير لدى جميع اللبنانيين على الحاضر والمستقبل.
So far, Mustafa Adib has vowed to form a cabinet of experts to reignite deadlocked talks with the International Monetary Fund. Internal and international observers are set to keep a close watch on the changes they demand to Lebanon's sectarian system, and the IMF has made clear that such reforms are compulsory if the country wants to reach a bailout agreement. Just after he was nominated, Mustafa Adib went to meet residents in Jemaizeh, one of the neighbourhoods most heavily affected by the blast. Neither his predecessor nor President Michel Aoun have been to the neighbourhoods since the explosion on the 4th of August.
Today, as he spoke to the nation as their Prime Minister designate, he said that he was looking forward to moving ahead. Now was not the time for words and promises, but the time for action. However, many people on the streets feel that the existing parliament who voted him in and President Michel Aoun, who has now nominated him, are still part of the old political establishment. There was a call today for a protest against the protesters by the FPM, President Aoun's party, and here we have Cesar Abi Khalil, who had some words to say. He is an MP from the FPM about the words that have been sent against President Aoun, saying that he was responsible for the Beirut blast because he knew a week before about the explosives stored at Beirut port. Here's what Cesar Abi Khalil had to say.
These allegations are false. They're made by people who are probably trying to protect the criminals who brought in the explosives back in 2013. Who was the president in 2013? Who was the prime minister? Who was the minister of public works? Who was the head of Lebanon's ports? Who was the director of the port of Beirut?
على مرفأ بيروت.
Now, many of the people who believe that the president was responsible for those 200 deaths and thousands of injuries just a few weeks ago here in Beirut have decided that enough is enough. They have to leave the country and they do not believe they have a future here. Thousands of people who have a foreign passport or a foreign visa fleeing from Lebanon, and many hundreds more trying to apply for visas to get out of the country, which they feel has no future. Hear the words of one family who have decided enough is enough.
In a different world, Carl and Hannah wouldn't be leaving Lebanon.
We are forced to leave. We would have preferred to stay.
Both Carl and his brother Hannah are leaving to France in a few days to pursue their studies. For the mother, the idea of both her sons leaving is difficult to accept.
What can I say? We've always lived as a family.
Hopefully we'll be back.
We will not be gone for too long.
Before the crisis, I was delighted at the idea that I could visit them whenever I want. But now it's no longer possible. Our salaries are no longer enough to buy a ticket.
Carl and Hannah's mother is a public school headmistress. Their father is retired. Lebanon's inflation made their revenues drop by 75%.
Those in power have humiliated us. They've made us hate our life here. If we stayed, we wouldn't be happy, and abroad we'll certainly be uprooted.
We're at the Martyrs Square in the center of Beirut. Thousands of Lebanese used to gather here during weeks of protests to express their anger against the government and call for political and economic reforms. But some of these people have now decided to leave Lebanon, like Shireen Qabbani. Shireen, could you tell us how you have made your decision to leave your country after all these weeks of political activism?
Because you lose hope in change, in reforms, and in a cause you used to believe in. Because you lose hope in any form of accountability. Because you no longer believe that you will get back your stolen money.
5 years ago, Shireen founded a charity project where she collects donations for the poor. With the economic crisis, some donors have become themselves beneficiaries.
People come here begging. They're begging, and I'm psychologically exhausted. I'm tired because I'm a mother, and I know how hard it is. When a mother comes in and tells me her baby is not eating anything besides water with sugar, how can I go back home and give my baby milk?
With her husband and their child, Shireen will be moving to the United States. Her sister will take care of the charity work. She's leaving a project she loves much to seek a better future for her child.
Many of those who have to stay or have chosen to here in Lebanon are hoping that there might be some help to come from the international community. But when President Emmanuel Macron of France came just after the Beirut blast, he walked the streets of Beirut and was thronged by people saying, "Please help us. Please don't give money to this government that we believe is illegitimate and will steal from us." He hugged them in the street. He shook their hands, something that they say neither the president or the former Prime Minister has done for them. He is returning tonight for another visit, which is one of the reasons many people suspect that the nomination of the new Prime Minister was pushed through so quickly, because, of course, France, like many other countries, has been pushing for governmental reform so that the country can move forward, both with the aftermath of this crisis and, of course, with the reforms to the economy that have been called for a long time. So he arrives this evening, and we spoke to some of the people on the streets of Beirut about what they hope he will say and whether they believe that he and other countries can do anything for Lebanon now.
ما في حدا بلبنان عم بيساعد، يعني دولتنا ما عم تساعد، فلما يجي حدا من برا يساعدنا ما عندنا أمل إلا إنه هو يساعدنا. فناطرين إنه يعمل قرار كتير منيح للبنان ويكون قد كلمته يساعدنا.
هلا هو انا منه ما عم بستنى، انا بستنى من اللي موجودين هون انه هن يعملوا يطلع بايدهم شيء يعملوا، بس هن مش خرج بكل صراحه، لانه تجربوا من قبل صار عاملين حكومات كتير مشتركه مع بعضهم، يعني كل الاحزاب ما نفعوا. هلا هو عم بيجرب يضغط عليهم ضغط ليعملوا شيء للشعب وللبلد.
كل الدول عندها اطماع بلبنان، مش بس الرئيس ماكرون، كل الدول عندها اطماع بلبنان. امريكا، فرنسا، مين اللي ما عنده اطماع بلبنان؟
So when Macron arrives tonight, he will be met by President Hollande, and then he will be having various meetings, both political and social, of course. He will be going back to meet with the people that he promised he would return to speak to in Lebanon. And France, of course, has been associated with Lebanon for really its entire history as a country. There used to be a French mandate here. And tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of an independent Lebanon, an occasion which would have been cause for celebration until this tragedy just a few weeks ago here at the port behind me, the port that still sits largely destroyed. So when he comes, he will be pushing for reforms. But many are concerned that by associating himself with this government, that many protesters and activists say is still chosen by the old political elites, by the old parliament, and by a political system that demands that people vote based on sectarian parties rather than what would be a real unity government for people, they say. Many are concerned that Macron is hitching his wagon to an outdated political elite and not really working with the young people of Lebanon who say they do want a new Lebanon for the next 100 years. Now, there are many issues for Mustafa Adib and this new government, this cabinet that he will put together to deal with. He says that he will impose reforms quickly and he will listen to the people and work with those on the ground. The volunteers here who say that they've had no help from the government in rebuilding, in clearing the debris, as many of them still lie injured in the city. And now, of course, so many issues to deal with, one of which, perhaps the most overmounting after the initial clear-up after this tragedy, is the huge economic crisis that Lebanon has been going through, an 80% devaluation in the currency of the last year, which even before the explosion left many unable to afford food, unable to afford rent, medical supplies, and now, of course, that situation even worse with almost 300,000 people homeless in Beirut. Here is a little more on that economic crisis that's dominated the country over the last year.
As Lebanon enters its 100th year, the country is in the middle of one of the worst economic crises in its history. Protests erupted in Beirut last October in response to a proposed tax on calls made via internet-based apps such as WhatsApp. The law was rapidly withdrawn, but the damage was already done. It had proved to be the straw that broke the camel's back. Starting at the end of the civil war in 1990, decades of chronic mismanagement and rampant corruption has plunged the country into darkness. Now, after years of malpractice, the banking system has all but broken down, with people locked out of their savings and limited to $200 withdrawals every 2 weeks. The government's finances are also in a desperate state. With national debt standing at 170% of GDP, Lebanon is now the third most indebted country in the world. After it defaulted on its debt repayments, the government applied for a $10 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund, but talks stalled. Adding to that, the uncertainty has seen the country's currency devalued by over 75% since October, and its credit rating decimated. Further adding to the economic pressure, the civil war in neighboring Syria, which caused 1.5 million refugees to settle in Lebanon. Unemployment now stands at over 25%, and with inflation skyrocketing, the World Bank last year projected 45% of the now 7 million strong population would be below the poverty line in 2020. Since then, a devastating explosion has ruined parts of the capital, and the coronavirus pandemic has halted the tourism industry, a sector that makes up 1/5 of the country's economy.
And those issues there, just a few of the many that this new government would have to deal with, and of course the people on the street who are the people who really are suffering from this economic crisis, from the aftermath of this blast, they will all have to deal with. Now, we've got a lot of special coverage of Lebanon today, not just this special, but in an hour from now, François Picard will be hosting a special debate on Lebanon, and he is here now with me for us to speak a little bit more about these issues.
Yeah, because when we talk about reform, Leila, in Lebanon, it seems as though there's two parallel tracks. There's, on the one hand, the political reform, the wholesale political reform we've been talking about that the people have been demanding, as you say. And then there's the IMF's medicine. I can't help thinking, watching that report, is Lebanon's current leadership ready to take it?
Well, this is exactly the question. Of course, what was happening with the last government under Hassan Diab was that when he came in January, he promised that he would impose these reforms within 6 months. These reforms that have been asked for years. There is still $11 billion available for Lebanon to tap once they're willing to impose some of these reforms. They've now asked the IMF for another $10 billion, but those talks, those negotiations over that sum stalled after it became clear that Hassan Diab's government simply wasn't able to push through those reforms, and really many of them not willing. One of the problems, of course, is that the old school political establishment are unwilling to do things that will be seen as unpopular among those who vote for them. Because then they'll lose the votes that keep them in power. And of course, austerity will be incredibly unpopular at a time when so many people are already suffering. But without some of these changes, which include cutting huge numbers of the people working in the public sector, which is very bloated, and also floating the currency to actually allow it to achieve some stability, because there are 5 different exchange rates on the street at the moment, which is very confusing in terms of being able to afford items and knowing how much people's salary can actually buy each day. That's going to be very unpopular as a move, but there is no way to stabilize Lebanon's economy without it.
Leila, on August 4th, when that blast hit, the France 24 debate was on summer break, and I can't help but still be moved by the images behind you. That is, confirm for us that infamous warehouse number 12 we see?
This is exactly behind me, this warehouse that exploded and set fire to so many others. I came down to the port just 2 days after the blast, and I walked through it, and I have been at the aftermath of so many explosions, and none have been like this. The haunting, eerie silence as rescue workers. I was with a French team sent from the government, a French civil defense team, desperately trying to drill through layers and layers of concrete to try and reach people that they suspected were still alive. And of course, we were talking at the time about how many hours they'd been there, how many hours they could survive. We all knew that the numbers didn't add up and they weren't going to reach them. Their desperate family members sitting outside the port begging us for news, and yet they still went on, and eventually, of course, just pulled out bodies. This scene now behind me, and you can see that huge grain silo that collapsed, spilling out the wheat and corn that had been stored as a stockpile for Lebanon, and this port that's so important, where 80% of Lebanon's goods come in completely destroyed. It's now partly rebuilt, but they are going to keep part of this as a memorial to the around 200 people who died here. Of course, we still don't know exactly how many, because there are many still missing.
And next door to where those chemicals had been stored for several years, turns out, Leila, there were fireworks?
There were fireworks, there was some ammunition stored there. They still haven't been able to decipher exactly what was stored there, actually inside the warehouse, they think, and this is part of the problem. The government said in the aftermath of this explosion, they said that within 5 days they would have found the culprits. What they then did was they arrested many of the fairly low-level employees at the port, the people running the port, who they say are to blame. But of course, we now know that both Hassan Diab, the former Prime Minister, and President Michel Aoun knew at least a week before, they were told at the end of July, that this highly explosive ammonium nitrate was stored there, which has often been used as an explosive intentionally by terrorists. And there was 2,750 tons of it. And we also have evidence that in the years going back, it's been there for 6 years, that many successive governments and heads of the port were warned about it as well. And now that it was stored, we've seen pictures now how it was stored incredibly irresponsibly, the bags open and indeed next to explosive items. questions. As I say, the investigation still has not had a result. People furious that in 5 days they were supposed to have a result. A month later, still no news, and they feel that, as always is the case, the people higher up will not receive justice and the people lower down will be blamed, many of whom had friends and co-workers who were killed working here at the port.
Yeah, how to literally pick up the pieces, what to do when Emmanuel Macron visits and he touches down this hour, and more broadly, can Lebanon reform itself? We'll be asking in the next hour. Leila Molana-Allen will be with us in the France 24 debate. Many thanks, Leila.